I'm Jessica Badalana, staff editor at King Arthur Baking Company.
And I'm David Tamarkin, King Arthur's editorial director.
And this is Things Bakers Know, a new podcast from King Arthur where we explore every corner of the baking world.
Every episode of Things Bakers Know dives deep into a different baked good, its history and lore,
trends, takes, and opinions.
A lot of opinions, and plenty of tips and tricks.
Plus, we'll always leave time to answer your home baking questions.
Along the way, we break bread with the best bakers, historians, and restaurateurs in America, and we always get their expert advice.
So join us at King Arthur as we celebrate the wide world of baking on Things Bakers Know.
Out now wherever you listen. Subscribe now so you won't miss an episode.
Head to kingarthurbaking.com/podcast to learn more. That's kingarthurbaking.com/podcast.
And until then, please, people, remember to follow the recipe.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways, hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Zella Palmer. Sitting next to me, y'all, is the George McCalman, Grenadian-born, East Flatbush raised. George is an artist, creative director, and co-principal of McCalman Co. in San Francisco. Y'all, it's been amazing hosting George here in New Orleans. On today's episode, we have a lot to cover: the legacy of Black portraiture, George's bicultural world, and his latest book, Illustrated Black History, honoring the iconic and unseen. Welcome, George.
Thank you. Thank you, Zella. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start with young George and the duality of being a Caribbean man born in Grenada, but raised in Brooklyn.
I think about growing up, it's not something I honestly thought a lot about because as a young boy, there are things you don't see.
Mm-hmm.
I spent the first 9 years of my life living and being raised in Grenada. And then my mother and I moved to East Flatbush in 1980. And the juxtaposition was more shocking than anything at the time. It took me a lot of years to settle into how different America, Brooklyn was compared to what I knew growing up in Grenada. And even though I lived in a neighborhood that was primarily West Indian, what other people call Caribbean, we call West Indian, which I still do to this day. There was a lot that just felt foreign. America felt really foreign to me growing up. And there was the grounding of our family, and Caribbean families are very much set up the same way. At the time, being an immigrant was something that was not seen as a pejorative. And we had, and still do, have so much, my family has so much pride in being West Indian immigrants in the United States. There's a pride that we had in our culture that we celebrated internally. But when we went out, it was clear that we were representing our families, we were representing our culture. And assimilation was something that was more openly discussed, that in order to get ahead, we had to assimilate, but we did not have to leave our culture behind. And the juxtaposition and the duality and the nuance of that made all the sense. It was not a conflict. It didn't feel wrong. My family worked hard. They presented that to us, my cousins and I, that if you wanted a particular kind of success. You just had to work for it. And that America was not going to give it to you without that work. And so now I spend a lot of time in Grenada, and I see the kind of rippling back of that, where so many of us are spending more time at home, that we have found our success on our terms, in our way, but that we are back home to celebrate those successes and return that success to our native country. And it has no, I became a citizen when I was 15 years old. I'm a proud American. I have no issue with being, with saying that proudly, no matter who is in office. I love this country, and I know its failings. I know its faults, and I still love what this country has afforded me. And so I can also represent the nuance in that. Knowing what it is not does not require me to dismiss what it is.
Did Brooklyn inspire you? Did Grenada inspire you? Who inspired you to begin your journey as a graphic designer, an illustrator, artist, painter, writer, so much more?
Whenever I'm asked a question about what inspires me as an artist, I always give the very disappointing answer that it's not people who inspire me. It is the land of Grenada. It's where I get my color sensibility from. It's where I get my organizational sense and conceptual. I have always been keyed into the patterns of the natural world. And long before I knew that that was a thing, you know, I've always been, it's not other artists who inspire me. And it's always a disappointing thing, because I think we think that we're only supposed to be inspired by other artists. And there's a lot of artists that I love, but I can tell you that that is not where I draw my inspiration from. And so when I was a kid who drew, I was a kid who drew and scribbled, and in all the margins of my notebooks, I was that kid who obsessively drew. And I created worlds. I created stories, novels. I was a kid who was really interested in the arts. My family was not terribly supportive of it, because at the time it wasn't something that Black people, the tangible, you know, there were a few tokens of success, but it was not something that was granted to us. And so I don't fault my family for not being supportive of that. But what they stated was, we don't understand this. If you want to do it, you're going to have to work for it. And the rest, they just let me figure out.
So you said that nature was your inspiration. Was sound also your inspiration? Because I'm thinking about the 80s Brooklyn, thinking about Grenada during that time period and the revolution that was happening there under Maurice Bishop. And it was soca playing, calypso, hip hop in New York and Brooklyn, especially you were, a child during that time period. So did sound also kind of motivate you in your creative process as well?
You know, that's a fantastic question. Sound did not inspire me, but it was a constant. Brooklyn at that time was loud. And one of my favorite films that documents what living in Brooklyn, there are very few films that show that time in history. Spike Lee's Jungle Fever is like one of the best, but also one of the best.
Yes, classic.
And not even Do the Right Thing, not even Crooklyn, specifically Jungle Fever.
Classic.
And what it did is it showed at the time the series of satellite tribes that all lived next to each other. Brooklyn was just clanging, loud. There was music. There were people shouting. It was, and it's one of the things sonically It took me a while. It's why I didn't have a great time in Brooklyn when I first moved there, because it was too loud. And the sound that I was used to in the Caribbean, which gives me the most peace, is the natural world. It's the cicadas and crickets at night. It's the sound of rain on galvanized metal roofs. It is the smell of soil when it has been raining. That is what I feed off of. And so it's one of the reasons I left New York, was that the sound and the people and the volume just turned me off. And I had to recognize that as an artist, I need quiet and I need to hear my own thoughts. And as much as Brooklyn and New York gave me, there was a point where I realized I needed to leave New York in order to center myself inside of whatever practice or whatever I did professionally. I had to go to some place where it was quieter so that I could become the person that I am.
That's powerful. So for me, I'm going to tell a quick story because I'm full of stories. He knows me by now. And that's what I love of, sitting down with him, because he listens to my stories. I listen to his stories. We had a beautiful dinner last night with a previous guest on Culture and Flavor, Dr. Melinda Lowry. And we all talked for hours at Compare Le Pen. It was everything that I think all of us needed. It was sacred, it was grounding, and it was inspiring. And the push, I think, that I can speak for myself, that I needed. I was thinking about our interview today, and I was thinking to myself what Black imagery meant to me as an African-American woman from the South Side of Chicago as a child. And I think about the print media and the images that I saw growing up. Jet, always in the bathroom, Ebony, or at any hair salon, and you had to wait for your mom or your grandmother. It was Ebony, Jet, Essence. Yes.
That was also part of my formative understanding. But I also come from a place where I didn't not know who we were. And so it was a different kind of thing. I wasn't looking to that imagery. Even as a boy, as a teenager, I wasn't looking to those things. And I always knew that I was fortunate that I wasn't searching for that. I also grew up in a house where all of that imagery was there. But it also felt different from what I knew and how I was raised. I grew up in a Black country. And all, decades later, recognizing that I was born and raised in an African country. I don't think at the time I was thinking about how all of these pieces fit together. But growing up, I always had a strong sense of me as a Black boy moving in the world. And New York at that time was just like a hotbed of chaos and really galvanizing moments. The Central Park jogger, the Tawana Brawley case. Those are all things that are etched into my brain. My family was very active in watching the news, knowing what was going on, speaking openly to us about their perception of how Black America was treated by its majority, and how we were always going to be made to feel like we had to work harder when we should not and did not have to. Like, working hard was not part of the American narrative. I didn't grow up feeling like I had to chase an American ideal of success. I have not gone through my career at all, ever, thinking that I was chasing the American dream. I knew in my 20s what I wanted my career to be. I started thinking about it as a teenager. I was raised by a single mother who was very successful in her commitment to herself. She was very much involved in the community. She has success working at the UN and owned her own, bought her own apartment and had her success, and my mother didn't rely on anyone else. And so that was modeled for me, that I was raised by a single mother
In Brooklyn.
who certainly had her hardships, but never gave me the impression that she was toiling. And she was someone who was very politically active. She had a lot of very left-leaning, magazines, and she was very much paying attention to how this country treated us and what I needed to do in order to make sure that I wasn't stuck in someone else's version of me.
I think, when we go back to growing up in the 80s or 90s, and, it's always fascinating to me when I hear students or even young people, they're so in love with the 90s and the 80s. And so I remember, the Dewey Decimal System. And I remember one book in particular, and when you wrote your book, I said, "Oh, wow, this is profound," because I remember going to the library and pulling the International Library of Negro Life. And this was an encyclopedia of African Americans in either the 19th and 20th century. And my great-grandfather, Dr. Joseph Henry Ward, was in that book. And I remember being a little girl seeing the illustration made of him and what impact that gave on me as a descendant. And so when I looked at your book, it was in color,
And that was a really important piece of this. And this is the Caribbean. That book is illustrated from an immigrant's sensibility. At no point did I think that I was representing all of Black America. What I was representing was my perspective of American history. And I spent a couple of years, the project I did that led to the book was something that was all in black and white, because I didn't want it. It was going through my notes recently and thinking, I wrote a thesis of the original project, not even the book, but I did a daily painting of a Black history pioneer, and it was all in black and white. I did not want color overwhelming me or my ability to do it. I hadn't made art in that way in years, and I didn't want to psych myself out. So I gave myself parameters, and I stayed within the rules. But then when I finished and started realizing that I wanted to make an exhibition, I wanted to make a book, I wanted it to have a longer shelf life, I started thinking into the color. One of the interesting things about the book that I made the decision that every portrait was not just going to be in vibrant color, but it was going to be a different art style, which also this country tells you that as a fine artist, you're not supposed to do. That I was supposed to have done a book of every Black person having the same sensibility, and that did not make sense to me. I wanted to individualize every single pioneer. I wanted them all to have their own sensibility. I wanted to focus on the individualization, that we are a collective, we are a diaspora, but I really wanted to show that these people were all very singular. And the art style had to be singular, representing each person also.
Y'all, we'll be back in a few minutes after a few messages from our advertisers. Thank you, George, for joining us in this first half, and I can't wait for you all to listen to the second.
This episode is brought to you by Plugra European-style butter, crafted for those who demand precision and exceptional results in the kitchen. With 82% butter fat and a slow churn process, Plugra gives you flakier crusts, fluffier cakes, and rich, melt-in-your-mouth pastries. Because great baking starts with great butter. Unlike standard American butters, which have only 80% butter fat, Plugra ensures the ideal moisture and fat balance so your recipes turn out just right every time. That's why professional chefs trust Plugra and home bakers love it. Plugra's slow churn process creates a smooth, creamy butter that gives dough a soft, pliable texture, making rolling, folding, and laminating effortless. Whether you're perfecting a buttery pie crust or layering a delicate croissant, Plugra helps you bake with confidence. Experience the difference for yourself. Find Plugra in stores near you or visit plugra.com. That's Plugra.com.
We're back. So, I'm just thinking about some of the things that you said. And I'm thinking also about gentrification in Brooklyn. What's also happening in a lot of countries now where we're seeing, land being bought up in the West Indies or Caribbean. It's a shift that's happening in our culture. And I remember Harlem and what it was when you talked about jungle fever. I remember the South Side of Chicago, the West Side of Chicago. I remember Brooklyn, Flatbush, Bed-Stuy, and it doesn't feel the same anymore, not like it used to. Obviously, for gentrification reasons, we don't have the vibrancy of that we used to, or the street culture that we used to have, and the at least not in places like where I'm from, Chicago. There's a silence that's over our neighborhoods, and everything is boarded up on the South Side of Chicago. And it's hard to see, because I remember Miss Glenzie across the street who came from Mississippi, all of the elders and the block club parties before crack, happened to our neighborhood and the crack epidemic, and before social media, when everybody was in the street playing hopscotch and, all types of different hand games, slide, going to, Screaming Wheels in Gary, Indiana, to go roller skating, all of these things that brought us together, although we were in this very Black, very beautiful moment in time. Things changed,
Yeah, and I have a different perspective on these things. I was the beneficiary of being young at that time and having that influence, but things change. Nothing stays the same ever. And I don't encourage nostalgia for something like that where culture does not stay the same. There are things that we can look back on. At the time, we did not think it was great. The truth is. And
Facts.
In the rearview mirror,
yes,
we can romanticize
yes
what Brooklyn at that time was. But Brooklyn was a hard place.
Hard.
And it was mostly working class and lower middle class families.
Yes.
That were caught in this. And it wasn't fun. We can look back and talk about that time being a time of alchemy, and it's the truth. And the 80s led to the 90s, as the 70s led to the 80s. And it's cyclical. Every 40 to 50 years, it circles over again, and we just make the same. Peaks and valleys all over again, but just with the lack of a sense of continuity, history, and context. And I think that, we can, growing up during that time, I was conscious of families being together. That certainly was true. But I think that right now we have just the framing of our everyday life is just so different. That would not exist here. And we just have to find our own way of attending to that, because there is always going to be a need for that. The idea of a centrality of community, as a Black community, as any community, it's not unique to us as Black people. We all need that. And it's something that our country is crying out for right now. And so it is still a challenge to figure out how to do that and incentivize it in a world that isn't set up for that anymore.
So, talking about imagery, I want to talk a lot about symbolism there. Kendrick Lamar, he gave this incredible performance. It was incredible performance. But I heard some elders I was walking past a a little bar in old school bar in New Orleans, and they said it's too much symbolism and not enough activism. I would love to hear your thoughts about that. Are we in an age of just symbolism and no action, or are we in this kind of pausing or neutral period where we're still trying to figure out what you said, what is community going to look like going forward?
I think we are in an intermediary period. The world is changing, and straightforward activism, I'm sorry, does not work the way that it used to.
Mhm.
And I think we're all conscious of that. The older generation is frustrated by that, and they get to be frustrated by that because they're right. There isn't enough activism on the ground floor. And we have a culture of visualization right now. And the internet and social media is a place for people to perform activism. But it is not, it is taking a new form, and we're still finding our way into it.
Mm-hmm.
Because even now with Trump's second term, the communities are much more quiet than 8 years ago. I think we're all seeing that just taking to the streets alone does not actually move the needle, that there is a coordination and a long-term strategy that the Democratic Party did not have. That's why they lost. And that it requires more of us resetting and starting again with a longer view of how we are going to advocate for ourselves.
So what made you write this book? I mean, in this critical time and place in history right now. And a lot of these, I think you had 135 pioneers, about 300, 145 pioneers that Black pioneers that you wrote about. I think 340 illustrations or plus.
Over 300 pieces of art in the book. Yeah.
You were drawing, painting. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful, graphically designed books I've ever seen written about Black history, and in color, as you say. And so I would love for you to just kind of talk about your process and why this book is critical at this point in time. Because when I think about all the media that we don't have, what do we have? The Shade Room? What do we have?
Mhm.
What do we have to communicate with each other and to honor our past and our ancestors? And why did you choose these 145 pioneers?
So I'm going to speak for a lot of immigrant people who decide to tell stories of American exceptionalism, which is that we spend a lot of time thinking that we're not qualified to tell these stories. And the truth is, I spent a year and a half not thinking I was qualified to do this book. And I was thoughtful in a way that if I were born in this country, I would never have put this thought, to be quite candid with you. I was like, there has to be someone else who is going to do this. And I kept thinking it should be American born. It should be someone who is on the inside. I still saw myself as outside of Black American culture. I didn't feel like I was the right person to be doing it. And I'll tell you what shocked me out of that reactionary way of thinking. I was being so considerate of the overall tenor of this that I was basically keeping it from existing. And the Legacy Museum opened, and I took a road trip with my friends the second month. And I walked through those two museums, and it was like I was just slapped in the face. That those two museum experiences transformed my perception of myself telling this story. And I remember my friend Leonard, just us walking out, and there's the lounge in the Slavery Museum, and people are sobbing. And I'm watching Black and white people and every color in between sobbing because they're learning about the history for the first time in a way that they feel it. It's not just homework. And I remember my friend Leonard turning to me and with tears in his eyes, like, you better do this book.
Yeah.
And I never thought about it again. I never second guessed my ability And I also realized that if I didn't do it, it wasn't going to get done. Not that someone else couldn't do this, but why did I have to think that there was just going to be one book? That there should be 35,000 versions of this book out there. And I was just going to make one version of it. And it just, my perception just shifted. And I then turned my attention to attacking this book.
But, thank you for sharing that, because, I hear conversation, from both sides, from both immigrant, Black immigrants, as well as African Americans, about who has the right to create and tell stories, but when I'm a historian, and we wouldn't have a lot of the liberation movements that happened in the 60s, 40s, 60s without Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, who were West Indian. At least Malcolm X was part West Indian. His mother was from Grenada, right? And thinking about hip hop, like you grew up in Brooklyn, and it wouldn't be
that all came from the Caribbean,
right? And you listen to it, and you listen to soca, you listen to hip hop. It is
the
ska. It is all of
has
that.
Provided so much of the fabric of American culture, and even knowing the history of so much of that, I was still so respectful of not overstepping my bound. And this is just mainly a conversation with myself.
Right.
It's not something I broadcast. It was only with my closest friends that I even registered an ambivalence, and that it was a huge undertaking, and I wanted to make sure that I was qualified to be doing it. But then when I had the experience of going to Birmingham, I never looked back.
I felt the same way when, you've been very helpful and instrumental in helping us get out this, my next documentary, Grenada to the World, Island of Spice. I, also was kind of, rattling through my brain at night. Should I do this? I'm not Grenadian. How do I tell this story? But I think, it's a way you tell other people's stories, being respectful of who they are. Because if you don't tell the story, it's just going to go to the grave, right? And we have to revive, kind of this Lazarus moment. We have to revive these stories. And I think, one of Madame Barbara Trevine, my mentor right here in New Orleans, she would always tell me when I was writing or going through different research process, she said, did they wake you up at night? Did they whisper in your ear? And I believe that, And
that's the experience I had.
Also. So which person, which pioneer woke you up in the middle of the night, or whispered in your ear, or led you to where you needed to write or draw?
So I've spoken about this elsewhere, and I never get tired of saying that this book was first and foremost a spiritual experience. And making the art for this book was one of the deepest, most profound experiences I have had as a human being. Every ancestor came and spoke to me about how they wanted to be rendered. And Dr. Maya Angelou was one of the figures in this book who announced herself early. It was one of the portraits I did early. And then she became a steward in my studio. And her portrait was up in my studio for several years. And the vantage point of her staring at the other portraits I made, the portraits would cycle in and out of my studio as I made them and then had them photographed. But her vestige, her aura, her essence, her stewardship was there throughout the entire project. And there were several times where I would go into a fugue state and I would just be painting, and then I would finish, and then I would come back into my body. And then I'd be staring at the pioneer who was staring back at me. And it was like, oh, thank you for helping me render you. the way that you want to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that felt like a true calling in this book. The other pieces of the book were difficult and required rigor and time and all of that. But making the art for this book was a fluid, fantastic spiritual experience.
What did you learn about yourself, or what did you learn about Black American or American history that you'd like to share?
What I learned is more personal than anything. I learned that time plays a huge role in our history, and how we think about our history is not rendered enough. And it's one of the things that we are working on right now. Illustrated Black History is becoming a traveling exhibition. And one of the main things that I got from making this book and setting up this exhibition's reason for existing was focusing on how we as a Black diaspora think about time. And we are in this country, so history is presented in a linear fashion and a literal fashion. But as we as Black people know, that's not how that works. That is not how that works. We know that time is circular and things cycle over and over and over again. And I have a personal phrase, I call it time folding unto itself, where you get to see a moment in time rendered again. And in terms of making this book, I got to pinpoint how the actions of one person affected the next person, affected someone 5 years, 20 years later. And what we were always trying to do in the writing, my co-writing partner, was signal how what the various pioneers did to set up the accomplishments of other pioneers. And having this lattice, this crochet, this web, where we get to see how all of our actions complete a larger tapestry of how we as a community operate, you cannot help but feel a part of history. It lets you feel closer. It's not just homework. What I am tired of, and fundamentally tired of, is Black history being presented as homework. I'm over it.
Come on now.
It's too good.
But is it even homework anymore? Because I have, it's young, a lot of young people have a watered down, sanitized version, see quotes on social media, regurgitating every Black History Month. And
the same 7 people.
The news, just kind of came out that they're going to release the MLK papers with an effort. As a community, we know what's coming, that they're going to find out that MLK was a human being and he had desires and wants and all of the emotions that a man has at that time, leading a movement. But yet we have so many other pioneers as well that were doing a lot of work. There were Fannie Lou Hamer.
That people don't even know about.
And not just Fannie Lou Hamer, so many unsung, which I'm always on my soapbox about my great-grandfather and so many other great-grandfathers out there.
Unseen and the iconic.
The unseen and iconic. And I want you to kind of talk about, how did you write and create portraitures of those who have been seen many times, like James Baldwin? But how did you, tell his story, but tell it in a different perspective?
So making a book, making books in general, is an exercise in organization and reorganization. And as someone who was doing all parts of this book, I had to basically set up a way that when I was doing my research and I was doing the historical aspect, I had to figure out how I was going to tell the story. And the answer is actually in the title, Iconic and Unseen. I wanted the book to focus more on the unseen than the iconic. My bias is all over this book. There are more women than men in this book. There is more of a sense of people that you don't know. And even when I had, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the perfect example. I didn't put him into the book because of his basketball accomplishments. I put him into the book because he's a writer and scholar. I always wanted to show a different, I was having James Baldwin, who's one of my heroes, personal heroes. I wanted to tell different kinds of stories about him. So even though you will read about James Baldwin, you're going to find out things about him that you did not know. I didn't just want to go through the same, 7 accomplishments that people know in the Black History Pioneers who are trotted out every February. And everyone, the internet and social media has trained people to just kind of blur the edges of nuance, and that everyone is a saint.
It's the American way, it's 2 for 1.
So annoying. And has nothing to do with anything.
Talking about unknowns, there were a lot of unknown African American artists, West Indian artists in the 20th century. And I think about Leah Chase, when the late Leah Chase, who has an art gallery at Dookie Chase restaurant. And a lot of times African American artists could never get into, some of the art galleries of New Orleans or New York, etc. So they would trade sometimes paintings for food because they were literally, starving artists. And so a personal story of mine, my mother, when she was alive, and my grandmother, they were always looking for a painting that was commissioned by John Wesley Hardrick out of Indiana. And he did a lot of paintings of local Black Indians. I want to show you this painting just so you can see it. And it got me thinking just about, African American material culture, how we tell stories, and how integral portraits were in right after slavery, before slavery. They were iconic.
I got a lot to say about that.
Okay, I want to hear it.
Because I just shared today, along with the De Young Museum, they commissioned me a couple of years ago to write about the history of Black portraiture. I was interviewed by NPR with one of the curators at an HBCU in the South. And we were both talking about how we as a Black culture, there's always a desire to equate our perception and our progress with other communities. And what we were both talking about is that in terms of portraiture, this did not really start being a thing until the late 1800s. We're only a little over 100 years in us being presented.
That's deep.
Visually.
Yeah.
And what we know is visualization is propaganda. And so, when I call Black history homework, what I'm talking about is that it's always the same visual language. It's always this downtrodden, black and white, minimal, grainy, even as recently as the civil rights movement, which wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
It's not by accident that MLK is shown in black and white, not color. There was plenty of black and white to show him more as a human being instead of just a deity. And so we are in an age and a renaissance of Black portraiture right now. It is a majority of what is being moved in the art world. It is specifically representational, because we are still, and I literally just said this in the voiceover the other day, we are representing ourselves for the first time, where it's not just incidental, it's not someone else's, like we actively as artists. And I know I am part of this Black Renaissance. I am focused particularly on Black identity and rendering our community with the fullness of how we as people need to be presented and displayed.
Mm. And so how do we display ourselves looking forward? Because I think, I was in Johannesburg um, this previous fall, and I went to the Apartheid Museum. And I previously was talking to you about how I remember the posters, and, my mom passed, and I just remember I have all of her pins, all of her posters from that time period. And, when I went in the Apartheid Museum, there's all these posters. I mean, and they're so bright, and, they punch you in the face like, end apartheid now, So what do you think is coming in this renaissance, and how are you and other artists? I mean, I know you can only speak for yourself, but what does this renaissance involve?
I think what the Renaissance involved is a level setting
Mm-hmm.
of which always has to happen. And you can be frustrated with the timing of it. You can be frustrated by how quickly it is or isn't happening, but it's a level set that is going on right now, where I think we will be moving into a lot more visual activism, because there's a lot that we haven't touched in terms of typography, in terms of abstraction, in terms of minimalism, that there's a lot that we have to say and show, that we're moving into more politicized timing, and a more politicized time. And there's much more that is going to be called for.
And how does AI, I mean, it's AI can create so much now. How do we stay authentic in this space, or how do we use AI to our advantage?
I think it is one of those things. I have a lot of opinions about this that are not popular, which is that AI is here. It's not going anywhere. We all understand the idea of this being honest and authentic. That left the station
Long
years
time ago.
ago. And we are having a reactionary conversation about something that is already way into the future. We have all missed the boat.
Yeah.
This has all
Yeah.
happened already.
Yeah.
And even the marketing rollout and how dishonest these companies have been about how long AI has been around. It's represented that it just appeared a couple of years ago. It's been over 10 years. I live in San Francisco, so I see this. I know the people working at these companies.
They already have flying cars. We just haven't,
They already have a lot of things that the average person does not know. And I live in a city, what I call a beta city. San Francisco is a city where these ideas developed by white men are tested out. And so we are the city that gets to see a lot of these things first. We're all case studies, and we're all guinea pigs, whether we like it or not. And so, what Black people always have is we always take culture, we squeeze it and disseminate it our own way. I have no doubt about us and our ability to take someone else's idea and make it better. That's what we do. We make everything culturally, technologically, we make everything better. And so I'm curious to see how that's going to manifest. I have no predictions, but it is the same way we took and alchemized Black Twitter, the same way we've taken all these cultural forms.
Language,
music, film, dance. We make everything more expansive in our sleep.
And so it brings me back to just your creative process, and how you said that Grenada is now a sacred place for you. I understand that you were caregiving your mom. I also had to caregive my mom at the last moments of her life. It was beautiful and hard, and those moments with her, did it bring you back to Grenada just to be still and quiet, to go back to the crickets and the cicadas? Did she give you any advice, on your future creative process? Because you are your work is integral to telling our stories, and a nuanced story,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
My mother, it's a long story about my relationship with my mother, and that I don't know that we have the time to
Yeah,
really
for sure.
dig
We
into
can,
that.
yeah.
But what my mother did, as she always did, my mother is really opinionated, clear. She played a really important role in an aspect of illustrated Black history that I love telling. My mother's the reason that I decided to change what was the third person to the first. This book is written, the entire book is written from my perspective, which felt so maverick that I was, it was one of the decisions that I was struggling with inside of the longer form of just all the decisions going into making a book, where there are decisions you have to make all the time that affect the course and the process of what you're working on. And my co-writer and I had been going back and forth, and I was really reticent to changing it. And so April ended up redoing the paragraph, ironically, or the entry rather, for Dr. Maya Angelou. And it was about a month before my mother died, and I'd relocated to Florida to be one of her 3 caregivers. And I remember coming out and reading her the passage, and my mother was really kind of dry sense of humor. And I read it to her, and she said, "That's it." And I said, "Well, isn't it too much about my perception of these pioneers?" And she just looked at me like, "Isn't that the point?" And I remember just being like, "Oh, right. She's right." And so we went back and rewrote all of the entries. We redid the entire manuscript of the book to represent basically the closeness of my understanding of American history and how the pioneers that I was speaking to, they got under my skin, and I was representing the third person meant I was distancing myself from history. And writing it in the first person brought it all much closer to me. I was really thoughtful about all the pieces of this. And as I was thinking about this book, initially, I was not supposed to write it. I thought it was just one too many things. And I wanted to do a good job with the design and the art. And it felt like more than enough to focus on. But as time went on, I had done so much research that I was starting to realize that I knew what I wanted to say about each pioneer, and that there was a way of doing it and writing about it that I could write it personally about history. And I was also basically presenting how I wanted to relate to history. I wanted it to be more conversational. I didn't want it to be a series of charts and timeline and dates. And I just no, I wanted it to be more a discussion and less about, in 1973, this happened, and then that happened, and then that happened. I said, no, I want this to be an ongoing dialogue. I want this entire book to be an ongoing dialogue.
But I think that also brings it back to your roots in Grenada, because Grenadian culture, and West Indian culture is full of parables, stories, and it's that direct connection to, Africa. And I think, you just
It's griot culture.
it's yes, absolutely.
It's storytelling culture. And my family is super gifted at storytelling. That's why I'm a storyteller. That's why I'm good at it. Is that I was raised by people who are exceptional storytellers. The person who has influenced me the most in this realm is my grandmother, who is 101, sharp, there, vibrant, and she's the best storyteller that I know. And I roll with a lot of really gifted storytellers, and she blows them out of the water, because to this day, she can tell you a story with detail with background setting, a story that happened in 1955, as if she were still there, while she's making herself laugh, while she's setting the scene, while she's telling you all of the ancillary elements, while she is, and she has you by the throat as she's telling you this. Like, you are hanging on her every word. And that fidelity to storytelling is something that I have my Caribbean upbringing to thank for.
I'm so appreciative and just in awe of, even just soca music. Like, every year there's carnival in the Caribbean, and every year they're putting out, every month there's a new song. I mean, it's Motown, and and that is part of that storytelling process.
It's true. We tell stories in music, culture, clothing. And it's something that no amount of racism has ever been able to stamp out. It is in our DNA. It has been passed down. We are all the beneficiaries of it. We are some of the best storytellers on the planet. And we just have this gift of being expressive in a way that this Kendrick Lamar thing is a perfect analogy to this. He's telling the story of America in front of everyone at this point where we are resetting our view. It's like, yeah, it should be symbolic. He's letting everyone know, reminding everyone who's staring at this, this is where we are. That is what is required of him as a hip hop artist. He is actually telling our American story. And that this is the thing that's triggering so many people. Black, white, chartreuse, azul, great.
But we need triggering at this time.
That's what I'm saying. Great.
Because a lot of us is just, just
coasting
numb.
Coasting along, numb. And he's making people angry, and I love it.
Well, we are looking for more stories from you, George. I can't wait to see what's next. What is next?
I mentioned it earlier, but Illustrated Black History, honoring the iconic and the unseen, is being turned into a traveling national 10-city exhibition. It is called A March Through Time, and there will be more announcements about it. The show is premiering later this year, 2025. It is my life's work. I'm super, super excited about it. Alongside that, the work that we are doing, that my business partner and I, Miriam Thompson, are doing with McCalman Co., our firm, our agency, is really cultural work. We're really dedicated to telling stories through marketing, through branding, through strategy, dedicated. And the work that we're doing this year is just singular, and it's fantastic. And additionally, in my copious spare time, I'm also writing my next book. And it is taking a look at museums.
What? I love museums. I went to school for museum studies and everything, so I love it. And I grew up in a city that was full of museums.
And the working title is How to Fix Museums.
Wow.
And,
I want to read that.
And it is, and it's, the whole thing is maverick, because that's what I like to do. I like to do unconventional things in unconventional ways to produce some form of a conventional result that is accessible. And so I'm writing this book with an executive director of a California museum and an interpretive director of a Northern California museum. And so we represent three perspectives inside of the internal bureaucracy of how museums make all of their decisions. And so we're writing it together, this trinity of basically what is dysfunctional, what works, and we're offering solutions, and we're writing into the genealogy of museums, what they are socially there for, and what they've gotten away from. I'm super excited about this.
I remember in grad school reading about Fred Wilson. I remember even there was an exhibition in Toronto. I can't remember the name of it, but you walk in and you think it's this, telling this story of this Irish immigrant and how, the suffering that she went through, only to find out that it was all staged.
Mm-hmm.
And it, after you leave the exhibition, you start thinking about how information is, delivered to you and what is true and what isn't true, And so museums have a lot of work to do. They're, obviously, it's highly contentious. When we think about, what's his name? The exhibition complex theory by Michael Foucault, and his idea of how things were displayed during colonialism, So I'm just nerding out right now, but I'm excited to read that book.
Excited.
I can't wait to see that happen. And I definitely want to come to the inaugural worldwide exhibition.
You are going to be there. You're going to be there. It's going to be hot and popping.
Okay. I'm going to have my hot and popping outfit on.
That's right.
Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of Culture and Flavor, and safe travels back, George.
Thank you so much for having me, Zella. This has been wonderful.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Yeah. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.
I'm Jessica Badalana, staff editor at King Arthur Baking Company.
And I'm David Tamarkin, King Arthur's editorial director.
And this is Things Bakers Know, a new podcast from King Arthur where we explore every corner of the baking world.
Every episode of Things Bakers Know dives deep into a different baked good, its history and lore,
trends, takes, and opinions.
A lot of opinions, and plenty of tips and tricks.
Plus, we'll always leave time to answer your home baking questions.
Along the way, we break bread with the best bakers, historians, and restaurateurs in America, and we always get their expert advice.
So join us at King Arthur as we celebrate the wide world of baking on Things Bakers Know.
Out now wherever you listen. Subscribe now so you won't miss an episode.
Head to kingarthurbaking.com/podcast to learn more. That's kingarthurbaking.com/podcast.
And until then, please, people, remember to follow the recipe.